My apologies for that. I hope you're able to hear me.
Yes, we can.
Thank you.
A very good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. You must be wondering, where is the promised moderator, Mr. Ngure? Unfortunately, he had a medical emergency and he will not join us today. We also have an apology from Professor Githu Muigai, who something came up and he will not be able to join us today. We apologize for that, but we promise you a fantastic session. You will learn as we promised, and it will be very engaging, and we hope you stay through. We'd like to start with a prayer from one Ruth Jabet. Ruth, take the floor. Miss Ruth, can you hear me? Seems like she can't. So I'll give the prayer myself. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for giving us life. We thank you for giving us the ability to learn and understand and engage in meaningful discussions that impact society. We ask that as we have another discussion today, may you go ahead of us, may you be with us, and may we be as successful as humanly possible. May your presence fill us, may you help us keep being better human beings and better readers, and may we keep being useful to society. For this we pray, trusting and believing in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
And yes, amen. Thank you. And welcome to the Avid Readers Forum. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a forum that began in September 2019. It's a forum for reading and having discourse on academic matters, emerging legal issues, and whatever we deem fit to discuss. As I mentioned, we began in September 2019, which means we are marking our 5th anniversary this month. So thank you for joining us as we celebrate 5 years of existence. Today, we are discussing a topic called democracy at odds, the will of the people versus party politics. Basically, it's the intersection or lack of it between what the people want, which is supposed to be democracy, and what their representatives want, which would be representative democracy. And to lead us in that discussion will be two people. We'll have Honorable Gitobu Imanyara. He's no new name. We all know him. You know him either from your legal circles or just from your household, because he is a household name. Mr. Honorable Gitobu Imanyara is an advocate of the High Court, and he is also a former member of Parliament, which means he is extremely suitable and valuable for this discussion today. Honorable Gitobu, thank you very much for joining us. We'll also have Miss Luciana Thuo. Miss Luciana Thuo may not be a politician, but she does know a lot about politics, elections, and democracy. She is a teacher, a distinguished teacher. She is a consultant, and she is in the field of elections law, and she has a specific eye for minorities and gender equality. Ms. Luciana, thank you very much for making the time to join us today.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And my name is Marion Joy. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be stepping in for Mr. Samuel Ngure, who was supposed to be here, but he had a medical emergency. And for those of you who are not there when we began, receive the most deepest apology from Professor Githu Muigai, who will not be able to join us despite being willing to do so. Something came up and he unfortunately won't make it today. But as we promised, we will have a very wonderful discussion. So stay tuned. Yes, and we'd like to now start. The program will roll as follows. We will have the lead discussants, leaders in the discussion. So we'll have Honorable Gitobu and Ms. Thuo give us the initial thoughts. And then the floor will be opened to you all for an engaging session. You will get a chance to ask your questions, you'll get a chance to make your comments. So feel free to do so. And then we will have closing remarks from the lead discussants. And that will be the end of the discussion. We intend to finish up at 4 p.m. East African time. Thank you. And we'd like to now begin with Honorable Gitobu Imanyara. Honorable Gitobu, we believe that democracy is about the people, and this year has shown us that that's not always the case, or at least they have to struggle so hard to get what they want, even when they have elected people to represent what they want. So, having been in the political space, you're also in the legal space. Do you think representative democracy can chill the will of the people?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joy, for this invitation, and congratulations on your 5th birthday of this avid readers forum. You're doing a great job, great service to the people, and particularly the young people, because what I've found out is that there is very little discussion about our constitution. Our constitution is perceived as an elitist document that wananchi at the grassroots level know very little about. And so this kind of discussions are useful in bringing out issues that I think we need to address. And coming to the subject that you've asked me to speak on, or the question that you've posed, party democracy as envisaged in the Constitution of Kenya has failed, completely failed. And I think it's time for us to accept that as a fact and try to reset the mode so that the vision and the guarantees that the 2010 Constitution envisaged can be realized. And part of that reason is that, unlike Tanzania, where the founding president of the Republic of then Tanganyika and later Tanzania, when they merged with Zanzibar, is that we have failed to inculcate a culture of a nation. Those of you who've read the Kenyan history will remember that the colonial policy was based on divide and rule, and it was basically setting one tribe against the other. And for example, when people from what is now part of Mount Kenya, Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru, wished to move out of a particular region of Kenya, they needed permission from a chief, and this they needed to carry a kipande. At independence, when we had an opportunity to do away with the colonial system of governance, we chose to continue it, so that the country, rather than living as one united nation, sees itself as 42 odd communities or ethnic blocks. And when we introduced multipartism, the concept of multipartism in this country, we taught the people the wrong lesson, to see parties or multipartism as comprising of coalitions of ethnic tribes. We do not think as Kenyans. We think firstly as Merus, Kikuyus, Luos, Nandis, Kalenjins, Kostos, or Mijikenda. And therefore, our politics is organized around communities. When coalitions are set up, when government policies are set up, we see them in terms of, is our community represented? It's not that it's a Kenyan national policy. It is whether our community is included in or is at the table of eating. So this culture for the last 15 years or so, the new constitution has continued. And what we call multipartyism has ceased to be multipartyism, and it has now become multi-ethnic politics. And I think we need to acknowledge that as a fact if we have to move forward, and acknowledge that the tribe plays a key role in Kenyan politics. Our democracy has been ethnicized, and in order to entrench the democratic values that are set in the constitution, I think we need to start at this recognition, at this acceptance that our country has been deeply divided along ethnic lines. And if you're from a particular region and you run on a particular party that is not popular in that region, you will not be elected. And I can attest to this from my personal experience as a founding Secretary General of Ford Kenya, coming from a region that was not supporting Ford Kenya because they saw it as a Luo-based party. I lost elections, I won elections, but I could have been one of the longest serving members of parliament if I had played the ethnic card. So rather than pretend that ethnicity doesn't play any role in our national politics, I think we need to recognize that as a fact, as a starting point. An attempt has recently been made by the Gen Z's protest to paint a picture of nationhood. But unfortunately, it didn't get very far, or it has been stopped by the entry of ethnic politics, where one particular leader of a particular community opted out, and then as a result of that, there was a balkanization of the Gen Z movement that really was had a very negative impact on what they were doing. And that is why I insist that we need to reset the button, go back and find a new means of inclusivity, of enjoying the multi-party democracy that is entrenched in the Kenyan constitution.
Thank you very much, Honorable Gitobu. We hear you loud and clear. We need to go back to original democracy. Now, I'd like to switch a little bit to Ms. Thuo. And Ms. Thuo, you are in the legal space. You've done research for a very long time. Representative democracy is not a new topic to you. So in your experience or from your research, what do you think are the options of the people when government is very unresponsive? In the context of Kenya, can they reclaim their sovereignty under Article 1, or do they have to wait for the next general elections to replace their government? And this is also in view of the fact that this is also a debate that occurred in the Gen Z protest, where one faction says the president and the government must leave now, and the other faction says, hold on, we have a few more years, you can replace the entire government. So what do you think is the option for the people?
Thank you, Mariam. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. So please bear with me if I cough in between. Allow me to first start by echoing what my senior has said about the exclusionary nature of the way we have done politics in this country and how that affects governance, because that is the foundation of the discussion that we're having today. Honorable Gitobu has spoken about ethnicity as a founding factor, as a connecting factor. But it's also important to remember, and this is one of the things that the Constitution tries to acknowledge, that there have been multiple sites of exclusion that have happened in our context. Ethnicity is one of them. Age is another. Gender is another. Marginalization is another. And so there are multiple factors of exclusion that have operated to keep some people on the periphery of political life in Kenya. And any discussion around how we move forward from here must start with a recognition of the fact that there are multiple people who have been excluded from political life. Now, why is this important? We're talking about political rights, and political rights are really at the core of citizenship. Citizenship is about equal distribution of entitlement. It's the one thing that makes us the one thing that puts us on the same plane as citizens is that when we are in this country, we have the right to demand equal entitlements, and that is what distinguishes us from foreigners. The two things that as citizens we have in common are the obligation to pay tax and the right to be involved in the affairs of this country. So when you have demographics of people who are paying tax but do not have the same entitlements as everyone else in terms of political representation, that will always cause a struggle in terms of feeling like they are equal in the state. So what has ended up happening, Honorable Kitobo has spoken about ethnicity, but what the protests have shown us this year is that there have been a significant population of this country, in particular young people who have not been a part of the discussion and who are now itching to say, listen, we're not second-class citizens. Can we have a seat at this table? Can we not just be the subject of decision-making in this country? We have a right, if we are going to be affected by these decisions, to also be heard on those decisions. And that is something that we must acknowledge is going to have to affect the way in which politics is done in this country, because what we have done in this country is we've had a small fraction of the country making decisions, and then the rest of the people in the country must live with it. And so the youth, for example, have been seen primarily as pawns in the political process. We use youth for rallies, we use youth for causing violence in the context of electoral processes, but we don't want them to have a say in the way things are done. That is the way we have organized our politics up until now. So what we are seeing is now the youth coming and saying, listen, it cannot be business as usual. If you're going to impose taxation on us, if you're going to create a situation where we don't have the capacity to make a living, yet we're supposed to live dignified lives, which is again what citizens demand in their own country, to live dignified lives, then things must shift. But we must also acknowledge that these things are happening in a wider political culture which does not support inclusion. So what do you do with a constitution with a capital C, which has certain provisions in terms of equality, and we have very wonderful values, Article 1, Article 10, Article 38, Article 19, which is also very clear that the Bill of Rights is not limited to what we have in Chapter 4. So we have other provisions like Article 104, which I'll come to in a moment, which extend rights to us, including the right of recall to citizens, which are giving power to the people, but that is not being realized in actual practice. It causes dissonance, it causes dissatisfaction, because you're living in a country where you should have a say, but you're not having a say in the affairs that are affecting you. So coming to your question around what options do the people have, I think it starts with a realization that we may have done politics the wrong way. We may have resigned ourselves to being the subjects of decision making without realizing that when we adopted the Constitution, we afforded to ourselves the obligation to participate both directly and indirectly. You've spoken about sovereignty of the people under Article 1. A reading of Article 1 of the Constitution indicates that we have both the right to participate directly or indirectly through freely chosen representatives. But there is nothing in Article 1 that says that we can only exercise one at a time. When we participate in political affairs, if we take the right to political participation, there's three prongs of that right. The right to vote is only one prong. The others include the right to participate in public service and the right to participate in public affairs. The right to vote does not mean that we relegate participation in public affairs until the next election. The right to vote allows us to choose who will represent us indirectly, but we retain for ourselves a residual power to influence public affairs, and there are mechanisms for doing that. One of those is, for example, participating in petitioning of parliament, which is a right that we have in our Constitution. We also have the right to recall under Article 104. That right is treated the same way as a right in Chapter 4 because of a reading of Article 19.3, that the Bill of Rights is not restricted to Chapter 4. We also have a right as a people to call for a referendum. That right is not suspended until the next election. And that is why we must broadly understand that our sovereignty is not limited to the electoral process. Our sovereignty can be exercised both directly and indirectly, and it's up to us to choose at what juncture we exercise each. What we have tended to do in electoral cycles is to vote. We hope we have chosen the right people and then wait to remove them in the electoral cycles. In the next electoral cycle, we have not always activated the right to political participation fully. And that is what is starting to agitate now. People saying, no, we want to take back the power. So to your question around, must we wait until the next election? No. There are avenues for participation that don't involve the right to vote. The right to vote is only one of them. We have seen, for example, the right to participate in protest, which is a constitutional right. That right is a right that is available throughout. Of course, the state response to that right has been less than ideal, and we'll come back to that later on in the discussion. But that is a right that we must safeguard, because my senior Honorable Gitobu and others fought for us to consistently have the right to protest and make our views known and not have to wait until the next election to remove unpopular leaders from power. Number two is the right to petition Parliament. It's something that is not limited until the next election. We have a right to engage Parliament on legislation, to tell them the things that we want to see in legislation and the things that we don't want to see. Now, what has hampered that right is the fact that Parliament has not always taken seriously the obligation to make public participation meaningful. We don't know the extent to which they take into account the things that we tell them when we petition Parliament and when we make submissions to Parliament on laws. We have also seen, particularly with the finance bill, unfortunately, that even though people directly made submissions around what they did not want, the party positions, and of course, there were also allegations of money changing hands so that voting could happen for the bill, then hampered what became of our views on these particular laws. And that, of course, added to the discontent that people felt. The other avenue which we have, which is not necessarily a direct political right, is a right to also use other avenues to challenge decisions which are made by our representatives, one of them being the judiciary. The judiciary is a very strong actor in terms of the protection of the rule of law. And so we must also use in the intervening period, and I'm glad civil society has been very strong on the use of this institution as a way of safeguarding our rights as people to not be subjected to measures that we have not had an input in, or where we are clear our views have not been taken into account in enforcing those measures. So when you speak about, do we have to wait until the next election? No. Article 1 of the Constitution allows us to use both direct and indirect democracy simultaneously, and we don't have to wait until the next election to exercise our sovereign rights. I'll speak briefly on one element of direct democracy, which is the right of recall. Throughout this protest, one of the questions that have been asked is, why can't we simply recall our members of parliament? It is true, recall is one of the elements of direct democracy protected in our constitution, the other one being the referendum. And Article 104 tells us that we can recall a member of parliament or a member of county assembly before their term is over, if we are dissatisfied with the way they are exercising the sovereignty that we have donated to them. Now, we have had a problem with the fact that the constitution anticipates a legislative framework to give effect to the right of recall. And that legislative framework is the Elections Act, read together with the County Government Act when you're dealing with the members of county assembly. And our Elections Act, the provisions that were put in place to deal with the right of recall are sections 45 to 48. Section 45 in particular set out the grounds on which you may recall a member of parliament. And it set out a requirement that before you can initiate a recall, you must be able to demonstrate that at least 2 years have lapsed since the person came into office, and you're also not doing this in the year preceding an election. The section also requires, as it currently reads, that you must have a judgment of the High Court confirming the grounds for recall which are contained in section 48. And the grounds which are there include commission of an election offense, violation of chapter 6, I can't remember what the third one is. I'll come back to it in a moment. One of the things that then happened was the way in which section 45 of the Elections Act was crafted, because of the requirement that you must have a high court judgment in order for you to give effect to it. It became very difficult for you to actuate it 2 years into the election and not a year into the next election. The other thing which was problematic is the requirement under section 45 that you must also get a certain number of signatures before you can initiate your recall process. Section 46 also required that you had to have been a registered voter in the election that you're challenging before you can challenge that election. Section 48, which is one that sets the threshold before a recall election can be effective, says that at least 50% of the electorate must support your motion of recall for it to be a valid motion. So one of the things that became apparent is that the provisions on recall in our Elections Act were not viable. And so Katiba Institute went to court in 2016, challenging the provisions on recall in our Elections Act and asking the court to find that it's not possible for them to be activated in terms of removing a member of parliament together with a member of a county assembly, because they challenged both the Elections Act and the County Governments Act. If you look at the decision of the court in petition, I believe it's 209 of 2016, the High Court agreed with Katiba Institute that a reading of the provisions on recall under sections 45, 46, and 48 of the Elections Act were unworkable. In some instances, they were vague and ambiguous, and they were also discriminatory on certain persons. So that, for example, section 45 said if you had contested the election, you could not participate in the recall petition of a sitting member of parliament. So the High Court found that it was not possible to actually use the provisions of our Elections Act to remove a member of parliament. Since then, the County Governments Act has been amended. It's now clearer that you don't need a High Court judgment to remove a member of county assembly. The grounds on which you can remove a member of county assembly are also easier. So for example, incompetence is a sufficient ground for removing a member of county assembly. You don't have an equivalent provision for recall under the Elections Act. So Parliament, unfortunately, has not amended the Elections Act since the finding of the High Court in 2017. I know there have been proposals in the NADCO bill, both the Constitution of Kenya Amendment Bill and also the Elections Amendment Bill, to try and revise section 45, 46, and 48. But those have not yet been turned into law. What that means practically is we don't have a procedural framework for initiating recall under the Elections Act that is workable. I know that there then will be questions around if does the absence of a procedural framework then mean that we cannot actuate the provisions of a recall. I will ask litigation lawyers to guide me here. What do you do when you don't have a procedural framework for the actuation of a constitutional right? Does that suspend that right? That is one of the questions that I know is currently being debated. I don't have answers to that. So what I would say is we ideally don't have to wait. There are avenues for participation that don't relate to the election, and we must as citizens continuously figure out where we fall on those avenues and take them up. But we must also ask, what do we do with the existing mechanism where Parliament, which has a direct vested interest in a legislative provision, which would require then that we hold them accountable, refuses to pass the law that is needed to give us the tools to hold them accountable? That is a political culture problem that we cannot get around. And I'll yield the floor back to Marion. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Luciana. That was one heck of a lesson on elections law and representative democracy in this country. Thank you so much for that. You reminded me that there is a decision in the High Court right now that about dissolution of Parliament, and we look forward to how that will be. Now, I'd like to switch back a bit to Honorable Gitobu. Honorable Gitobu, Ms. Luciana has given us the legal context, the legal options that we have, but we'd like to know a bit about the political aspect, which there is a debate, granted, whether there's politics in law, and some say the legal is political, but I'd like to know from you, given your experience in both the legal field and the political field, how can the government of Kenya maintain its legitimacy? It's no secret that right now there's a huge question on whether the government should be in power right now. But from the political side and the legal aspect also, what do you think can make the government maintain its legitimacy? Should it bow down to the sovereignty of the people as it did with the finance bill? Or should it remain steadfast in its course of action, no matter how unpopular? And we have many examples to go with this. We have the Adani JKIA project. We have even the finance bill itself. So from a political point of view, what do you think? Sorry, we have not been hearing you because you have been muted.
Am I okay? You hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes, thank you, Madam Duo, for taking us through the various provisions of the laws that make it difficult to exercise our rights, our democratic rights under the Constitution. But I believe, from my own experience, what I've seen is that the reason and the only reason why this culture of impunity is so prevalent is that people have not yet come to terms with what is the Constitution. The Constitution is very well known to lawyers, to constitutional lawyers, to law teachers, to advocates who practice law, but the overwhelming majority of Kenyans rely on what they are told by politicians as to what are the contents of the Constitution. So our challenge, and I've had an opportunity to speak about this in another function, is to make the Constitution of Kenya available to the most ordinary person, the child in school. So we need the Constitution of Kenya in our various languages. We need book clubs about the Constitution in primary, secondary schools, and all learning institutions. We need textbooks, basic textbooks explaining what the Constitution is, what are the values that we fought so hard to codify in a document that we refer to as the supreme law. Until we reach that status, the Kenyan people will continue, the Kenyan ordinary mwananchi will continue waiting to be told what the law is by the DC, by the chief, by the politician, by the president. If we were able to inculcate a culture of constitutionalism to the lowest level of our Kenyan society, all these issues will not arise, because even little children in primary school will be able to tell their leaders, but that is not what the Constitution says. But now you see, because they need to rely on second-hand information about what is contained in the Constitution, what are the values of the Constitution, the executive is able to ride roughshod over the guarantees that are contained in the Constitution and set their own rules as the governing rules, so that when the president, for example, says he will not allow court decisions to interfere with decisions that or plans that he has for Kenyans, we are not obeying the Constitution. We are not reading the Constitution correctly. We are not obeying the culture that is required of us as leaders. So the basic challenge is to return to constitutionalism. We have allowed ourselves to create a situation where the legislative power of the people, as contained in the legislature, has been taken away by the executive. We have allowed co-option of the opposition into government, so that the checks and balances principles that were required or that are essential to maintaining our democracy have disappeared. And now, as a result of that, Parliament has no serious say in how this country is governed, because now they have become a rubber stamp of the executive. And the only remaining institution that can salvage the situation is the judiciary. But the judiciary is not the correct, is not the proper place and in a functional democracy for exercising or for implementing the values of the Constitution. It is the people, we the people, because those guys who are running the show are exercising delegated legislation. It is the people of Kenya that has delegated the powers that they are exercising over us. And we need to remind our people that we have a solemn obligation to defend these values that are contained in the Constitution by making the contents of the Constitution known to the most ordinary people. If the people are empowered, it is very difficult for tyranny to set in. It's very difficult for the kind of behavior that we are seeing from both the executive and the legislature to be accepted. It is a challenge we have to face. But before that, what do? We must find ways of reminding the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary that they exercise their authority on our behalf, we the people. And therefore, what the Gen Zs were doing, reminding the leadership that they do not have the absolute authority to govern the country as if there is no established law and order, cannot happen. But then, unless we have strong institutions that will support the movement of people, the exercise of the people power as contained in the Constitution, then we are likely to see a situation such as now, where disappearances can happen, where abductions can take place in broad daylight, in unmarked cars, or in cars that are bearing private numbers. And when we record these numbers and seek answers from the state, we are met with impunity or with denials, even in the face of evidence. It is because people have not realized that they are the ones who are empowering, making it possible for these people to ride roughshod over their rights. So I go back to the question: how many people know that the power that is exercised by the three arms of government is limited? And that is why we have a principle of checks and balances, that where one arm of government exceeds the authority granted under the Constitution, the other arm of government can take measures to correct the situation. That was the situation before 2010, when we had an imperial presidency. We are now seeing a return to these days, and therefore our politics has ceased to be the politics under the Constitution as envisaged by the 2010 Constitution, to politics of the era of one party can rule. And our challenge is to return the country back to rule of law and to constitutionalism. If the president and his cabinet, if the speakers of the National Assembly are not able to do this, if the judiciary is limited in its capacity to implement its decisions, then there remains the final authority, and that is galvanizing, mobilizing the people to rise and say, no, we must protect the Constitution. And unless the Constitution is protected, we take away the authority that you purport to exercise over us, because we are the supreme custodians of the Constitution. And can we do that? A lot of Kenyans will look in amazement at any person trying to challenge the government, because they think the government has power that it's exercising. So we need to go over that. And the only way to go over it is to let people know their rights. And the only way people will know their rights is to make the Constitution available to them. I've seen attempts to, for example, explain the Constitution to the teens, I think by Sandra Ochola, who has written a teens constitution in a language that the teens can understand. Now we need to go there and make sure that the teachers in teacher training institutions are taken through a course on the values in the Constitution. We need the values of the Constitution taught in all military installations, training colleges, either Lanet, Embakasi, wherever, so that people know that the supreme power, the only way we can move forward as a country, the only way we can kill corruption is by upholding the values in the Constitution. But for as long as these values are known to only a few people, to only the elite, then we will remain. All the struggles we've had, all the people who have lost their lives in this struggle will have died in vain if we do not explain to the people why there is this Constitution, what it took to get to the 2020 Constitution, and what are the most basic values in that Constitution. Only then shall we be able to examine the laws that are being passed by Parliament to see whether they measure up to the constitutional threshold. Because a lot of these laws that are being passed are obstacles. Like, for example, right now there's a law on demonstrations being championed as a private member's bill by a member of Parliament. This is a betrayal to the very concept of constitutionalism. This is a betrayal to the oath of office that a member of Parliament takes to uphold and protect the Constitution. If the checks and balances are broken down, then it is upon us, the people, to take up to the streets and demonstrate. Demonstration is the ultimate right that we possess, because we do not need any permission. And that is why they need to restrict this. They want to restrict this right. That is why they are abducting these young kids who are organizing peaceful demonstrations carrying the national flag and a bottle of water, because they want them to remain ignorant so they do not exercise this right. So that is a challenge. And as a politician or a person who has served in Parliament for 10 years, as a Secretary General of an official opposition party that had representation in the whole country, I can tell you that political parties are the most unsuited vehicles as of now to realize the values of the Constitution, because our political parties, unfortunately, coalesce around ethnic identities, which is not what the Constitution envisaged. The Constitution of Kenya envisages one united nation, one united nation, country where our diversity is our strength. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case because our politicians have converted the constitutional values into tribal values of protecting their own, of ensuring the selection of one of their own into the cabinet. Yet these are secondary, because we do not need to be represented in the cabinet to enjoy equal rights, which are guaranteed under the Constitution. So I need to keep emphasizing that we need to go back to the values and teach the Constitution and inculcate these values into everyday chores, everyday government policies. Every decision that a public person takes, whether it's a cooperative, whether it's a company, whether it's a political party, whether it's a welfare association, they need to know that these values that they're championing under those entities are actually protected under the Constitution, and they are not privileges that are given by the state. That is the most basic understanding if we are going to expand our democratic space, if we are going to save the 2010 Constitution, and if we are going to survive as a democracy. Because democracy right now is under threat, a very major threat from the executive, who has been encroaching on the rights of the other arms of government and personalizing them into executive decisions. That shouldn't be allowed to happen.
Thank you for that. Yes, we are together. Thank you for that, Honorable Gitobu. You have reminded us that power belongs to the people and knowledge is power. Thank you for that. Now, the Q&A session is about to begin. So members, I invite you to type in your questions, type in your comments, and we'll get to direct them to the lead discussants today. Before that, I'd like to bring in Ms. Luciana a bit to just give us her thoughts on something. So in view of the events that have happened Israel legally and politically, and the events that keep happening, Kenya is at risk of being falling in the category of the theory of societal ungovernability, where the state cannot govern. It's elected by the people, but the people want nothing to do with the government that they have. So everything that the government does for the people do not want. So do you think Kenya is at risk of being an extremely ungovernable society in view of the growing frequency of protests and dissatisfaction with government? And what do you think is the legitimate response of government to this? We have seen, as Honorable Gitobu has highlighted, there has been force use, their laws have been broken, people's rights have been violated, people have been abducted. But then some could say it's a means to justify the end for government to maintain its legitimacy. But on the other hand, can the government embrace service delivery and dialogue? And this is especially because some of the young people do not want anything that sounds like dialogue. And so, in your opinion, Ms. Tu, legally speaking, and even politically, how does Kenya fit into all these conundrums? Over to you, Ms. Tu.
Thank you, Marion. Before I take that question, allow me to just echo what Honorable Imanyara has said about culture problem. Just going back to why we cannot trust political parties to be making decisions for us. We must remember that we are in a society where we do a lot of bread-based politics, and I've had people calling them bread-based government. A lot of people think with their stomachs when it comes to political decision making, and that makes it very difficult then to trust politicians to make decisions on behalf of citizens. I'd like us to remember when it comes to political parties in this country are very weak formations. They're very personality-based formations as opposed to ideology-based formations. And therefore, even as we go into elections, we are clear we're not voting for people based on a particular ideology. We are really voting for personalities. And that is why we move from election to election with different political parties. Many of us cannot speak to which political parties were in contestation for power in 2013. Don't even go into 2007. Because political parties don't survive electoral cycles. Individuals move and they form political parties and they move and they move on. So that makes it very difficult to trust political parties because they don't have an ideology they espouse. But the second thing that I also lament is the fact that even when people say they don't align with political parties, they want to become independent. The concept of independent candidature in Kenya is a very fluid one. One of the things that studies have shown is that about 80% of people who become independent candidates were political party candidates who were disaffected with the way political parties do business. That then means we cannot trust even the people who are not aligned to political parties. And we can see even after the last elections, out of the 12 elected members who are independents, 10 of them aligned with Kenya Kwanza, which then tells you everybody goes into decision making for personal benefit first. The rest of you can wait until I am satisfied. So just to echo what Honorable Imanyara is saying, we cannot trust politicians with decision making. I want to cite a quote that I often use in elections law, which is the fact that history has repeatedly warned us. This is a quote from I think his name is Thomas Frank, a political scientist, who says that history has repeatedly warned us that democracy is too important for it to be entrusted entirely to those who govern. The idea that this is such an important thing that we cannot abdicate our responsibility to govern entirely to other people and hope they make the best decisions for us. And as Honorable Imanyara was speaking about people understanding the Constitution, it's also about us understanding this idea of sovereignty. What does it mean? I think until we internalize that idea, we cannot get the benefits of what it means to live in a democratic state. Once we get that right, then we now start to engage government with the right understanding that they don't exist as our bosses. They exist as people who do the will of the people. But coming back to your question about ungovernability and whether we have come into a space where Kenya is becoming ungovernable, I think it's very clear going into reflecting on the events of the last few months that Kenya has shifted. Whether we like how far the shift has gone, because I guess a discussion could be had about how impactful have the protests been in changing the way government engages if cabinet has come back and the bulk of the people we didn't want are back. We have not seen radical changes in the way we are receiving public services. We're not seeing radical changes in the way politics are being done. In fact, the ones who we thought were with us have now joined the broad-based government. We don't know who is speaking for us anymore. People have died. We're not sure whether they died in vain or whether they died for a good cause. One of the things that in my assessment has happened is that where political parties, political actors were driving the agenda, there is some level of fluidity in the way in which politics is happening. And there's an instability that has been introduced because now politics is not coming from a place of subservience. Politics is being done from a place of outrage. That then means that the government and politicians don't have control over the narrative anymore, and they need to be in control of that. Yes, sorry, they need to understand and appreciate that. Yes, the government retains a monopoly on the use of force. That we cannot do anything about. It's a Weberian concept. We adopted it. It's part of our culture. But it doesn't mean that government has a control of what people do with their outreach. And government needs to think about what does this mean going forward. Number two, that then means that when we talk about status quo, that status quo that we have now, this tenuous peace that is in existence now, is not going to remain forever. There's going to be a collapse at some point. Whether this collapse is going to lead us to the society that we want or not, we do not know, but there's a possibility of it. It depends on how we organize going forward, which is one of the things that I think we need to think about. What has happened in the way in which politics has been done is that politics has been influenced by a few because the majority have not been very well organized. The few who are organized have been able to assert themselves over the majority who are not organized. And that is how it has been that the few are controlling the majority. But what we are seeing now with the re-engagement of young people in public discourse, remember for a long time, and even the numbers from the last election show, young people have not been engaged in political processes. Is it because they are disengaged? No. The protests have shown us that young people are not disengaged. They are dissatisfied with the manner in which politics is done. They do not want to engage with the current political structures because they are not responsive to their needs. Nobody feels dignified when they are part of a process where their needs are not met, where their views are not taken on board. And it's clear that for a long time, young people have not been at the heart of the decision-making process. When you look at cabinet is not reflective of the youth of this country. When you look at appointments, whether it's executive appointments or otherwise, it's not reflective of the youth of this country. When you look at parliament, it's not reflective of the youth of this country. So when we talk about ungovernability, we are really talking about the fact that there must be a shift in the status quo to appreciate the fact that things cannot remain as they are because what you have happening now is a very tenuous piece and it must yield to something else. Does that mean that now we must give up on order? Because one of the questions that has been asked repeatedly is, should we keep going back to the street? I keep seeing on X people having conversations around, should we keep going back to the street? It may not be realistic to keep remaining on the street until the next election. There must be something around planning, because even if we remove the current government, which has been part of the agitation, someone needs to be in charge. Someone needs to coordinate. Otherwise, everyone operates individualistically, we all end up in a situation of anarchy. So it's not possible for us to now say we will not be governed as a people. But there must be a way in which the government has dialogue with us about why are protests becoming a common feature of the way we engage in this country. The other country that I know in the region that has protests as a common way of engaging is South Africa. I hear on average in South Africa, there's about 1 to 3 protests a day on just the state of affairs in that country. And it's an overflow of the level of economic hardship that people are going through, which is an offshoot of corruption in the country. There must be a way in which we create accountability for corruption if we're going to move forward. If there's no accountability for corruption, there is no way that the situation of the country being governable can be sustained. There must also be a discussion around what is an appropriate response on the part of the government. If the government keeps responding to people using violence, it will get to a point where they will not be able to sustain the masses. At the moment, they have been able to, because, of course, as we said, the monopoly of the state of the use of force remains with the government. The number of lives that have been lost versus what has been apparently achieved does not appear to be matched. But we must also remember, as people who are agitating for a new way of doing things, nothing gets achieved in a short period that is long-term sustainable. Everything that we have been able to do, including return to multi-party democracy, took long periods of time to achieve. And so even as we are thinking about going forward, we must ask ourselves, how committed are we in the long haul to the process? And the government must also ask itself, How long can it use violence in a face of a people who are operating from a place of outrage and hoping to maintain law and order in that situation without changing anything? Until that happens, the government will continue to face violence and people will continue to engage from a place of outrage, which threatens to create a situation of anarchy, which none of us wants. We must also keep asking ourselves legitimately, how do we move the conversation on service delivery? It's clear what we are putting into government in terms of our taxes is not being matched with what we are receiving in terms of service delivery from the government. What the government promised and promises in every election is not being achieved. The government must have an honest conversation with us about the rising levels of unemployment, the rising levels of inflation. How are we managing public debt? Because there are many things that we are not having honest conversations about in terms of the government owning what it can and cannot do. Of course, the government has said it's going to call for dialogue and has said that it's the Gen Zs who have refused to come to dialogue. So there's a question that we must address here, which is, the government says it's willing to dialogue, well and good. Do the people trust the government? The government is going through a trust deficit. So even as the government is saying they're willing to have a dialogue, the government must ask itself, is this a government that can be trusted? Because trust is what underpins all of our interactions with government. If we cannot trust the government, we are not coming to a dialogue with government. So the government must ask itself, what can it do to regain trust of the people? Because the efficiency of any government in terms of securing the happiness of the people will depend on how good it is to its people. If the people do not feel the sense that government is good to them, the people will not trust the government and engage with the government. So if we are going to move forward, and if we are going to avoid a situation of ungovernability, both sides must ask themselves very serious questions. Number one, the group that is agitating for change. We have tried street protests. These things will take a while before they can have the impact that we desire them to have. How do we sustain the momentum? Number one. Number two, how do we use what we have to our advantage to have the result that we want, not just in the immediate, but in the long term? One of the things that, even though we are saying young people are disadvantaged in terms of employment, unemployment and inflation rates affecting them, we must agree on certain things. Young people have various advantages. Number one, youth, meaning their capacity for risk-taking is higher. We saw it in the way the protests were being waged. Older generations don't have that capacity for risk-taking. Number two, young people have time. They have the time to devote to political causes. Older people don't necessarily have the time for that. Number three, young people don't have allegiances to party politics the way our generation and the generation before us did. What does that mean? You have the capacity to define the agenda and you have the numbers to mobilize towards that agenda. And that is why I think it is important as we are agitating for change, to ask ourselves, how do we capitalize on what we have and better organize so that we can have the results that we want going forward? One of the things that I have repeatedly asked when I teach elections law is, now that young people don't want to engage in democratic processes, how do you change the process if you're on the periphery of it? I think people are now starting to realize that if you're on the outside, it's very difficult to change the system. So how do we do politics differently going into 2027 so that now we are the ones who enter the system? Research shows that for young people, the first 3 elections after attaining majority are critical in terms of whether you engage politically going forward. So if you don't vote within the first 3 years of attaining the age of majority, you will never be a participant in politics going forward. So because the majority of young people have not been a part of political processes, we need to start asking questions now around, are we going to take part in political processes going forward? Are we going to be fielding candidates? But more importantly, how do we introduce a culture that is in line with accountability and the values we want, rather than being dictated to by a culture that does not serve our values? Remember, the political culture that exists now is about using young people and discarding them after elections. That culture does not bring young people to the table, does not give them an equal voice in the way decisions are being made. So how do we shift the narrative so that young people are not just the recipients of decision-making, but they are active decision makers? How are they going to take part in the electoral processes going forward? That is a conversation that young people need to have. How do you capitalize on what is working for you? Numbers, time, energy, lack of allegiance to a political cause. How do you use that to your advantage to influence the agenda going forward? But even for the government, to make sure we don't now descend into a situation of anarchy, the government must start to ask itself around how do we go back, rebuild trust? Trust has been lost. We must just accept that people do not trust the government. People have told the president repeatedly, we just want you to stop lying. People don't trust anyone who represents the government. So how will the government regain the trust of the people so that we don't descend into a situation of anarchy? Because for sure, the outrage levels are high. Violence does not stop the outrage. Violence only suspends the outrage. So that outrage at some point will need an outlet. The government is in control on whether that outlet becomes a positive or a negative outlet. Let me yield the floor back to you, Mary.
Whoa, thank you, Miss Luciana, for that passionate presentation, the response. Thank you so much. And you mentioned something that reminded me of the first question in the Q&A segment. You noted that it may not be sustainable to keep going to the streets every other day. It may not be sustainable to not have representatives, because then we have individual concerns, which at the long run may not be sustainable. So I'd like to begin the Q&A session with that. I see in the questions we have, that should be, sorry, I see in the Q&A session, someone is asking, Honorable Imanyara, if the Gen Z being leaderless is a good strategy, and will they at some point need to nominate representatives to do the, according to him, messy job of negotiating politics? And his question is in the context of the compromise and the risks that come with that. Can the Gen Z movement be sustainable without a leader? That's the first question. So I'd propose to ask a bunch of questions, and then I'll yield it back to the panelists for them to give an answer. That was a question by Omwansa. We also have a question by Peter Kipyegon to Ms. Honorable Imanyara, who's asking, what are your thoughts on the nomination fees set by political parties, especially towards young candidates, especially since the youths are not financially independent? What's the potential that, what's the solution that youth could embrace to promote their involvement in politics? We also have a comment from Mr. Cedric Adima, who believes that as a country, we have undergone experiences that have formed a retrogressive mind, especially that of the executive and other political institutions. Well, Mr. Cedric Adima, thank you for that. So before I circle back to the remaining questions, Honorable Gichobu, are you able to answer the ones that we have so far? We can't hear you. Perhaps you can unmute.
Yes, thank you very much. From my experience, because I was active in politics at that age of the Gen Zs now, is that it's absolutely necessary to have structures in place if you're going to have an impact. Because when you are leaderless, you are open to infiltration by claimants, pretenders to the throne. Unless we know that so and so is speaking on behalf of the Gen Zs, anyone who comes forward and says they are the leaders will be judged as the leaders. And it may not be wise to open yourself to infiltration of that kind. And I saw it happen during this recent Gen Z protest, where opportunists, political opportunists, and sponsored candidate or sponsored quote, leaders purported to be part and parcel of the Gen Z movement. But when it was clear they were not speaking for them on their behalf, or they even had any links with the Gen Zs. So as a matter of strategy, it may be probably wise to have a leadership structure, even though not made public. And we tried this in the original Ford when we started the Forum for the Restoration of Democracy. We just disclosed 9 people as the leaders, although we had more people in the decision-making process. Had we not had a structure in place, we would have not lasted 3 months. We would not have achieved the objective of having Section 3A of the old constitution repealed. So it's very essential for any sort of organization to have a leadership. And whether that leadership is publicly disclosed or not is another matter. But it's absolutely essential that you do have leaders. We have identified some who we can say are clearly at the forefront of this Gen Z movement. But then we can see the responses from the government towards them. If the government responds in the manner that it has responded to, by abductions of individuals who may not even be involved in the Gen Z movement, we make it very difficult for the ordinary Mwananchi to associate with such a movement if they cannot identify the values they fight for. Gen Zs came very well and very clear on the finance bill, and they were very, very successful. But after that, they were not clear on what the next step was. And I saw what happened to the movement, not really as a movement that was aborted, but as a stopgap measure for them to take stock and come back well organized. So my plea to them, and I support what they've been doing because we did it during our time, is that they must have a structure in place, they must have a plan of action, and they must have an objective after the finance bill. What, Ruto must go cannot be a goal that you can achieve overnight, but you achieve it through stages. And the stages are democratic and constitutional in nature by pointing out where the Ruto is going wrong and correcting him through means that are recognized in the law. Demonstrations are recognized, all right? So what we need to do is have a practical approach to what we want to attain at the end of this. Is it 2027 or is it Aruto must go within 3 months or 4 months? You must make up your minds as to what you want to achieve in the short term and in the long run. The long run being 2027 elections and how prepared you will be at that time. And this now touches on to the next question, because if the intention is to play such a crucial and leading role in the 2027 elections, you need to identify a party or form a party which will be the vehicle through which you can contest the next elections. Proceeding leaderless and without structures and without a plan of action will see you get to 2027 when you are completely unprepared and therefore give opportunity to a continuation of the regime that is now in place. So you make these decisions now and let us see by action whether you are an organized organization to which we should belong to. Because it's different supporting the objection to the finance bill is very different from supporting a candidate A or B in to succeed William Ruto as the president of Kenya. These are measures, these are actions that the leaders, whoever they are, of Gen Z must come to terms with. And I can tell you from my experience as Secretary General of Ford Kenya, and before that as a spokesman of the original Ford, it is absolutely essential if you're going to make any headway in the actions that you've already initiated. You've been wildly successful in getting the finance bill withdrawn, in getting the cabinet reorganized. Now, the next step is what can you make out of these gains in order to energize your movement to the next level? If your movement is long term, then the second question that arose is very valid. Are the political options that are available in terms of political parties, the vehicles that you want, can you afford the fees that are being required of you to become a candidate? The way to reduce the exorbitant fees being demanded of you is to have a strong organization can negotiate, because democracy is about numbers, and numbers do not require money to achieve in terms of electoral results. So it's important that you make these decisions now, and they will have an impact on the political parties, because a political party that charges you 100,000 shillings for a party ticket will not get 100,000 members. If a political party is organized in a way that enables an ordinary Kenyan, the poorest of Kenyans, to join without payment of a fee or with a nominal payment, then the tendency is that people will go towards that route. And what we have seen, the experience we have had with the Gen Zs is a mass movement, and no political party can ignore it. So if the political parties see that these young people have the ability to change the electoral representation, they'll come to you by reducing the fees that they charge. Because right now, what is happening is that political parties charge fees depending on the popularity of the candidate, the party leader. Because when you pay so much for a political party ticket A, the chances are that you get into parliament, and therefore you'll be able to recover your the money that you paid. This is negative in the sense that it encourages corruption. Just like people are spending huge sums of money to win a National Assembly seat, understanding being that once I join there, I'll be able to recover this money from the public, either CDF or from government projects. That is antithetical to the democratic ideals that are set out in our Constitution 2010. Therefore, we need to live by the values. And the values of the Constitution is about representation, is about doing what is good for the vast majority of people. It's not about your individual contribution. It's not political opportunism in order to gain a commercial interest in some government project or get an appointment. It is service, and service is what it is what engineered. It is what actually made us go to the streets in order to get the vision that is captured in the 2010 Constitution. And to me, again, I go back to the basics. Who is best placed, which political party is best placed to lead us into realizing the vision of the 2010 Constitution? It is not a political party that will go into government simply to get the MPs appointed into the cabinet. No, it's a political party that is genuinely concerned about the plight of the ordinary people. It's a political party that is concerned about the breakup of the education system, about the health system, how to fight corruption in practical terms, how to live by the oath of office that you take when you assume public office. These are the challenges that we face. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Honorable Gitobu. Thank you for that elaborate response. I'll now like to read some more comments and ask some more questions before I wrap in Miss Luciana. I'd start with Adeline Kipto. Adeline is happens to be the president of the Kabarak Law Students Association. Adeline, very happy to see you leading from the very front. Adeline notes that she's very happy to see Miss Tu outside class, and she's happy because you also taught her elections law and international humanitarian law, and she believes this has been a masterclass. Her question is, don't we think we should have something like a course on state leadership or something like a degree, so that we have people who are deeply aware of the situation, because she thinks that we are suffering from having clueless people in power. Thank you for your question, Miss Adeline. I'd also like to note a comment by Martin Olo, who asks, why do we have to talk to each other, to teach each other about the Constitution? He believes it's an elitist document and it is least understood by many citizens and the government, including the judiciary, legislature, and the executive. The concept of we the people is to be taken to its logical conclusion. It assumes that we are all on the same page. Nothing could be further from the truth. Our MPs, executive, and even Supreme Court violate the basic tenets of the Constitution. He further notes that there is a battle between the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court overturns the decisions by the Court of Appeal, and we seem to have decisions on the Constitution depending on the interests of the judges. Therefore, we do not need to go back to basics therefore, we need to go back to basics to recreate our Kenyan identity, confront police brutality, abductions, clamp on demonstrations, and measures like those. Thank you so much, Martin Olo, for your question. We also have a question from Joshua Kipiego. Joshua Kipiego notes that his question is based on one of the blogs written by the Kabarak Law Review, and it was written by a student on performance on double representation of parliamentarians, which is basically that more often parliamentarians get disciplinary measures by their political parties if they don't align with what their political parties think. So his question is on that. His question also ties to the question by Brian Kipchumba, who's also asking about the shadow party disciplinary measures against MPs who do not align with Parliament. Thank you, both of you, for your question. We also have a question by Karen Kawira, who's asking that one thing that is predominantly constant is that party politics contributes in a great way to the curtailing of democracy. Do you think that the Kenya's party list system for nominating leaders is responsible for suppression of democracy? And what would be an alternative to maintain a sober parliament? The last question to you, Ms. Tuo, is, do you think that the delay in having a functional, independent electoral and boundaries commission in place is a way of rigging elections? That's a question from Jacqueline Mongi. Before I circle back to the remaining questions, Ms. Tuo, I hope you're able to answer those questions. Welcome.
Thank you. I'll start with Martin's, because it's really a comment rather than a question. And I agree with Martin on the question of going back to basics. One of the questions that I consistently asked, as I've heard people say that I've taught them elections law. One of the questions I have always asked is, what makes us Kenyan? Because one of the conversations we need to have as a people is, what is our common objective? The fact that we adopted a constitution together does not mean we have the same objective in terms of what we want the constitution to do for us. And that is part of the challenge, I think, that is currently being experienced in defining where do we go from here. We do not have a common objective as a people. And if we do not have a common objective, it's very easy for the political class, which is smaller, to divide and conquer us, because they are better organized in terms of they are united on the question of taking for themselves. If there is anything that unites politicians, is their stomach. Because they are united on that question, they are able to form a united front against us who are the majority, who are not united. And I mean, this is a typical exemplification of the biblical idea of the Tower of Babel. As long as people are united, nothing will be withheld from them. As it doesn't matter how many they are of one mind. They can dominate us because they are united. So I agree with Martin on the question of having a national conversation of what do we want? What do we want from the political class? What do we want from our institutions? What do we want from ourselves as people? And I'll tie this to what Adeline is asking about the crisis being of people who are clueless. The problem is not that people are clueless. The problem is that human beings are limitedly altruistic. This is a concept that we draw from Professor H.L.A. Hart in the concept of the law. It's the idea that people are selfish by nature. Nobody is trying to help you out. By nature, everyone is wired to take care of their own interest. And that then means that if we don't find ways of harmonizing each of our own interests, and that's why we select government, we have situations where your interests are conflicting with mine, and I will always prioritize mine over yours. And it's the reason why we have situations where, even as is happening now, you have the opposition, which was supposedly speaking for us, but as soon as a window of opportunity opened up to speak to the government, they quickly abandoned us and they're now in government because everyone is looking out for themselves. So is the solution to form a school of leadership? No. The solution is to rebuild social trust. In Kenya, we have a deficit of two things: political trust, which is what we've spent the bulk of this conversation talking about, but also social trust. We do not trust each other in this society. We have become accustomed to each one of us stealing from each other, extorting money from each other. We do not trust each other to have each other's backs. And that is why we are having trouble coalescing, because social trust in this country is low. So the solution is not to school us. The solution is to develop a common sense of values that will drive us forward. Until we have that harmony of values, Article 10 will mean nothing for us. Article 38 will mean nothing for us. Article 81 will mean nothing for us. And that also ties to the question of the IEBC. The thing with the constitution of the IEBC is that in this country, everyone is trying to best the other. So we have created institutions in the Constitution, Chapter 15 commissions, and we've given them nice names like Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. But calling it independent does not make it functionally independent, because we find ways behind the scenes of pulling the string so that clearly the commissioners who sit in that commission are not independent. But it's not just in the appointment process of the commission, which of course we know is a very political process. Look at even the current IBC Act. We're supposed to have a selection panel of 9. 5 of those members of the selection panel are drawn from the political class, whether they come from the political party liaison committee, or they come directly from political parties, or they come from the Parliamentary Service Commission, same WhatsApp group. It's politicians that have a say, a predominant say in who sits in the Electoral Commission. Then how do we expect the Electoral Commission to function independently? We also have a law that says whenever there is going to be a gap in the Electoral Commission, 6 months in advance of a tenure of a commissioner ending, you appoint new commissioners. Has it ever been done under the current constitution? No, because politicians want to save as much time as possible to manipulate the process to get their own people in. And when you read books like Ahmed Isaac Hassan's memoir, one of the things that you see, the referee of a dirty, ugly game, one of the things that you see is that there's so much political machination, so that even when one political side gets the chairmanship of the electoral commission, the other side has to get the position of the secretary. So the whole structure is just wired to be a very politically partisan institution, so that you cannot expect the IBC then to deliver credible elections. And we saw in 2017, Chairman Wafula Chebukati coming out openly and saying even he was not confident he could deliver a credible elections. So it's not just in the constitution and what we have with this election panel now. The entire culture that we have as a people is really about individual interest over social interest. As long as that culture remains, it doesn't matter how nice the wording of our constitution is, we will remain in a situation where everyone is trying to get the best of the other, and that means we cannot move forward. If we want to move forward as a society, we need to rebuild social trust. And that is something that we must do alongside requiring the government to rebuild political trust with us. I'll take the question on political parties, but I would like Honorable Emmanuel to also speak to this because he has been a member of parliament. And so he knows firsthand the conflict that can exist between towing the party line and voting on conscience, which is something that happens quite commonly in this country. One of the things that I keep asking myself is when people are saying they're voting on conscience, are they really voting on conscience or are they riding on public sentiment? I'm never quite able to tell the distinction between the two. I highly suspect that even in those instances where members of parliament say they're voting on conscience, it's really about riding on public sentiment so that you appear to be on the correct side of history. But at their core, they don't always appear to have an idealistic position that they take on issues. But I stand corrected, and I will defer to my senior Honorable Emmanuel on this question. That being said, the conflict between representing the people and towing the party line is something that I think Article 91 also tries to address. Political parties are constitutional institutions. And what they're required to do in part is also to promote democracy. They're also supposed to make sure that as far as possible, the way they make decisions is aligned with what the people want. Because political parties in this country have not entrenched that culture, they remain individual based entities, charisma-based entities, which is why when one person, I like to ask this question all the time, if Right Honorable Raila Amolo Odinga left ODM today, would ODM remain as a political party? Unlikely. And that means then we don't really have ODM as a party. We have whatever Honorable Raila is, and then we follow and then we form an institution around them. That then means whatever the party position is can never really be the party position. It's an individual position. And I'm thinking about this even with the current NADCO proposals in terms of amendments. One of the things that has come out of the process, and I've had members of the Justice and Legal Affairs Committee say this repeatedly, bills have been drafted from the NADCO report, and they have been brought to JLAC for consideration. And one of the things that JLAC members keep saying is they have been told not to even change a single comma or full stop in the bills as they have been prepared. What that means is whatever they were told to do, they must do. So where is the will of the people in this whole place? Number two, how can Parliament claim to be an independent arm of government if they're doing what two political actors or a few political actors in this country want? So there's a wider context of the way in which politics is done in this country that we must have a conversation about, but I will defer to my senior Honorable Emmanuel around that conflict because, as I said, his experience is something that we can benefit from on that question. On the question of party lists, I agree, party lists are one of the ways in which, unfortunately, people have been robbed of representation. What the intention was of party lists under Article 90 of the Constitution is not realized. And the reason why it's not realized is a structural issue. If we go back to the process of the drafting of the Constitution, particularly the Bomas draft, it was never the intention of the Constitution makers that we subject marginalized groups and marginalized communities to the political structure. Because what was realized, and you can see this when you read the Committee of Experts report, what was realized was that the political class had failed women, youth, people with disabilities, and marginalized communities in terms of giving them representation. So the initial proposal around representation was to remove the representation of these people from political parties and have them as constituencies, as these groups that have previously been marginalized, choose their own representatives to legislative assemblies. That proposal never saw the light of day, and we eventually had the representation of marginalized groups being subsumed within the political party structure under Article 90, 97, 98, and 177. So can we achieve inclusion of these groups within the current structure? It is my estimation that it's not possible. Why? Whenever you bring women, youth, people with disabilities, and any other marginalized communities within the political party structure, the thing that determines the allocation of those seats is not inclusion, it's the will of the owners of the party. And that is why you have seen situations like what we saw in 2022. Someone loses an MCA election in Kirinyaga. They're appointed to the county assembly in Isiolo. What does a person, a male person, not a youth, from Kirinyaga know about the affairs of Isiolo so that they can sit in the county assembly to represent marginalized groups in Isiolo County. So there is a problem with subjugating the inclusion mechanism of groups that have previously been excluded to the very structures that excluded them, and then hope that they will achieve inclusion. It's not possible. So whereas it's the system that we have and we must work with the system that we have, that system is structurally flawed and is unlikely to give effect to what we want. I would listen to the IBC in a meeting yesterday, and they said 22 county assemblies in this country don't have a member of county assembly who represents disabilities. Not a single member. Even though if you look at Section 7 of the County Government Act, if you look at Section 36, there is a requirement that there be representation, and not just representation, but even when you're doing the list, you must prioritize. That's what the language of the law is. Prioritize women, youth, people with disabilities. So the law is not the problem. The problem is anchoring inclusion within the very structures that have fostered exclusion. You cannot expect the oppressors to be the ones facilitating inclusion. So I don't think it's possible for us to achieve the inclusion of these groups within the current party list structures. If it were up to me, we would revise the structure entirely and remove it from the political parties and have these members choose their own representatives. Be that as it may, I am aware that there is currently an amendment proposed to the Constitution in one of the NADCO amendments to increase, for example, the number of people with disabilities who are going to be included in Parliament. I think they want to expand the number. But as I said, as long as you're anchoring them within political parties, you will still have the same exclusion challenges that we have. Let me yield the floor back to you, Marian.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Luciana, for those well-detailed answers. Thank you very much. I trust those who asked them have satisfactory answers. I'd like to take it back a bit to Mr. Imanyara before we move to the concluding statement, saying that we have a few minutes up to the top of the hour. Mr. Imanyara, some questions have been directed to you, and I'll read some of them in the interest of time. So there's a question that is asking whether there's a problem with our democracy being organized around ethnic blocks, given that in countries like the United States of America, they're organized around the blue and red states. So they're organized along the lines of Republican versus Democratic. So if it's to be condemned, should we also condemn the Kenyan ethnic blocks if we are okay with that? Senior Gitobu, I trust you're able to answer that. There's also a question by Onesimus Musungu, who's asking that it's argued that the Constitution of Kenya came about to cure the vices that were practiced during the Moi regime. Do you think that we have actually achieved more civic virtued society with what's happening right now? And second, should we continue trusting this constitution with the existing constant tabling of bills that seek to limit the rights that are enshrined therein? That's a question by Onesimus Musungu. We also have a question by Franklin Mukwanja, who's wondering what the second liberation movement missed, which the younger generation could learn from as they have their popularly known as Gen Z protests. Lastly, we have a question by Martin Olo, who's asking about the ethnic blocks in the US. I think I've read this one. So Honorable Gitobu, I trust that you're able to answer those questions in the next few minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't know whether you can hear me.
We can hear you loud and clear, sir.
Yeah, before attempting to answer those questions, let me first of all go to what Luciana talked about regarding voting in parliament, whether it's as individuals or as political parties. The parliamentary standing orders are very clear. You vote as an individual. You may belong to a political party that sent you to parliament, but the purpose of the political party's existence is to persuade you to vote on the party position. But there's nothing that is binding on your conscience when it comes to voting. If it were not so, there would be no need for requiring individual MPs to vote, because all you'd have to ask, the speaker would ask the leader of the political party, what is msimamo hapo kwenu? So the standing orders make it clear that you vote on your individual capacity. You are not a mouthpiece of a political party. You represent a constituency, a ward, and you represent the people there. The political party is only served as a vehicle to reaching you to parliament or to the county assembly in order to represent the people. The purpose and the requirement for a political party to field candidate is because we deliberately chose to be a multi-party democracy. And a political party ought to have a stand on issues which bring we have parliamentary groups for all the parties. They sit down and agree on a party position, then go and vote in accordance with that position. They do not go to parliament to defeat a party position. But because political parties have not taken root in this country, and that is the point I began with, we need to recognize, and we need to go back and recognize the key role that our communities play. And therefore, when you join political parties knowing that they are just representing your ethnic interests. Don't pretend that they represent a political party with an ideology, because what I have experienced, what I've seen in Kenyan politics is there is no political party that has existed in Kenya with a political ideology. There are maybe some liberal or social democrats, but I've not seen a political party pursue an ideological position in parliament to the end. They change positions in a very opportunistic manner, and we've seen it recently where the official position, the largest party in parliament, has crossed and joined the government in order to preserve that government continued stay in power, which is a betrayal, a complete betrayal to the values for which they were serving as official opposition party members. So you vote as an individual on a position that your party has adopted in a parliamentary group or in a party organ meeting. But what we have seen, unfortunately, in Kenya is that political parties are not political parties. They are personality-based cults that serve the interests of the party leaders. Let nobody cheat you. The political parties in Kenya represent the position of the party leaders. And that is not what we fought for as the second liberation activists. We are fighting to get a multi-party system of government in place where the majorities are represented, where there is no imperial presidency, where the president respects the law, where the values enshrined in the constitution guide your voting patterns in parliament. We need to reset this and recognize the value. If you may not agree that it's a value, but the interests of a community, and accept that that is why you're there, to represent your ethnic interests, and therefore serve those interests without pretending that you are serving a higher ideal. We live a pretense as political parties in Kenya, because if I'm from a particular region, which is not ODM, and then I stand on an ODM ticket, I won't get elected. That's a hard fact. There will be exceptions to this rule, but the pattern is that parties represent ethnic interests in Kenya. Therefore, let us accept that is a fact, and then go back to what we were intending when we created this new constitution and said it's a multi-party democracy representing certain core values that bind us as Kenyans, not as Kikuyus, not as Luos, not as Merus, not as Kisis, but as a Kenyan nation. I've always advocated a return to a Bomas kind of a meeting to audit our 2010 constitution and see how well it has worked, and where it has not worked well, how can we make it more perfect? But what we are seeing now is not a return to the values of the new constitution, but a return to the one-party era of the old days. So rather than pretend that we are serving the interests of the new constitution, let us go back to Bomas. Let's call a constitutional conference where we go through this constitution and see where it has failed over the last 15 years in its existence, or 14 years, and how can we correct. So if we are going to have a referendum, it is a referendum based or informed by reasoned, by informed look at the document that we adopted overwhelmingly in 2010 with over 2/3 majority in 2010, rather than amendments that serve selfish minority or individual interests, as we are now seeing being sought by the current leadership from both within Kenya Kwanza and outside Kenya Kwanza. And therefore, to go back to the questions that the 4 questions that you asked me to answer, is there a problem with ethnic blocks? There's no problem with identifying with your ethnic community if it advances the constitutional values, not if it takes away the constitutional values. For example, if the constitution guarantees the right to live and own land anywhere in the country, if the narrow community ethnic interests are for chasing or devaluing that constitutional guarantee so that you can eject non-locals from a particular region of Kenya, then that is abusive. That's undermining the constitution. But if belonging to a community means enjoying the cultural values that stand out among those communities, that is recognized in the Constitution. Culture is specifically recognized in the Constitution, and it's a value that we should enjoy and we should be proud of. So it's negative ethnicity that is objectionable because it limits, it demeans, it undervalues communities that have been long marginalized. And I see attempts as our person being appointed to some place as a recognition of the marginalization that had existed for so long in the country. So that one community was seen to be enjoying the benefits of being in government to the detriment of the other communities. We need to reset, we need to go back and evaluate whether those provisions in the Constitution that address the issues of marginalization are being met. Is the equalization fund, for example, being utilized properly to benefit the areas that are traditionally marginalized? Is the right to title being used to ensure that all community land, for example, that is not grabbed by an individual? And I remember the old days when the whole of Maasai land was, in 1 or 2 group ranches, which were individualized and rendering an entire community landless, without title, without property, because leaders took advantage of the group ranch law, and being leaders of those group ranches undermined the principle behind the group ranches, which was to support pastoralism, and individualized it and continued to sell it so that Maasais lost their land. Historical injustices are not served by expelling communities that have settled in an area innocently, have purchased land innocently for value, and have lived harmoniously with people from those regions. But it's very different from asking us to address the historical injustices cost the Maasai communities by the loss of their land. That is genuine, that is a legitimate question that needs to be addressed. But you do not address it by taking away others' constitutional rights. We will never be able to go back the group ranches. Let's accept it. But how do we right the wrongs that have been suffered? And I'm just taking that as an example because all over Kenya, in the coast, in Lamu, the same is repeated. So we need a commission to address historical injustices, not roadside declarations by politicians. Okay? So there is nothing wrong at all about belonging to a community. No, but it's a way you exploit that right to advance an anti-constitutional agenda that is wrong. Number two, how different the interests of today are from the Kanu era, for example, are the benefits of the second liberation being felt. I'm not cynical, and I'm not so pessimistic as to say that there are no values or there are no we haven't made any gains since we adopted the new constitution. We have, and the new constitution has taken Kenya forward in many ways. The concept of devolution, for example, the freeing of the judiciary from the executive. These are real, tangible benefits that we should be proud of. We need to build upon the gains that we've already made. And the way to go forward, as I say, is to hold a constitutional conference to audit our constitution and see where we have failed and how we can fill the gaps. That is the essence of constitutionalism. That is how rule of law should be practiced. But where, for example, a court issues an order, however disagreeable, you are not right to take the law into your own hands, such as the acting Inspector General of Police has done, because you devalue the concept of rule of law. Because you destroy one arm of government, the other two will be automatically destroyed. I cannot understand how a person who has gone through police training, through civic education, and risen to the level of Inspector General of Police does not understand the value of following court orders. You do not serve the president of Kenya when you are appointed to a constitutional office. You are serving the people of Kenya, and your protection comes from the people, not from the appointing authority. Appointing authority is only exercising a constitutional power of gazetting your appointment. But the process that you undergo through in order to occupy an office is not determined by the president. And I think it's basic that we internalize the constitutional values and start behaving in a way, in a manner that advances checks and balances and therefore expands our democratic space. That is the only way Kenya can look forward as a nation that is moving forward rather than a failing nation. And I cannot understand, for example, why it is so difficult for the president to order an investigation within time limits of the number of people who have been abducted. These are young children. They're entitled to the basic right to life, the enjoyment of the right under the Constitution. But when the president says no case has been brought to him, and we see lists being handed over at State House, where does he live if he doesn't know that the abductions are taking place under his watch? These are the values. That is.
Sir, we may have lost you there for a second.
Sorry, yeah, I see that. Am I back?
However, we also see that the time is running. Maybe you could sum up in like a minute.
Yes, I go back to where I started. I think our multi-party democracy system has failed. I think it's time we took a fresh look at why it has failed. It's time we look at the constitution that we adopted in 2010 and audit it in the light of the experiences that we've had over the last 14 years or so. And if necessary, then introduce changes in accordance with that same constitution, not in accordance with the wishes of a political party, in accordance with the wishes of the people of Kenya on decisions that are informed by a fresh or a new audit of the constitution that we adopted in 2010. That way, we can entrench the values that are contained in this constitution, despite the setbacks we've recently experienced. So that's my message today. The constitution has not failed. We have failed the constitution. Let's examine those failures and why they occurred. Let us correct them and let us move forward as a shining example of a functional democracy, not of a failing state. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Gitobu. Thank you so much for that elaborate response. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. And with that, we have come to write about the finish line of today's session. I see we already passed a minute past the hour. Thank you so much. I'd like to make the final invite to our convener to give us the concluding remark. Mr. Elisha Zebediongoya, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marion. Joy, I trust that I can be heard.
Yes, you can, loud and clear.
Thank you. Time being spent, I do not have much to say, except to thank so much Senior Gitobu Imanyara for volunteering your time and your intellect and your experience to share with us the invaluable thoughts that you've shared with us this afternoon. We don't take it for granted. I remember that at the height of the Gen Z protests, my greatest desire was how I would get you to share your experience from the years gone by with our young Gen Zs on campus. And thank you so much, Ms. Luciana Thuo, again, for coming back to the Avid Readers Forum where you actually belong, to share with us your erudite thoughts, your erudite learning, and your very fecund mind, so that we are able to keep ourselves on the edge to listen more from you. I think it is Professor Issa Shivji who dared win the academy, that if there was a time when idealism was required, then that time is now, where people can reimagine the kind of society that they want to live in. And I think this afternoon has passed that test of that reimagination. Thank you so much, the students who showed up, and thank you so much, colleagues in the profession who came in. I saw Mr. Martin Olo, I saw Dr. Masi Mwara Deche, I saw Mr. Frank Mukwanja, I saw Mr. Georgiadis, among other colleagues in the profession who joined us, and we don't take your presence for granted. This occasion is part of the series that we are running to mark 5 years of continuous intellectual discourse under the banner of the Avid Readers Forum. We began running this series on 5th of September, and we are running it every week up to 4th of October, when we shall finish our month-long activities to mark 5 years of the Avid Readers Forum. We'll continue sending you posters and links for future engagements, and thank you so much. God bless you. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much to our convener, Mr. Elisha Ongoya. Thank you also for the idea of this forum. Thank you for convening us, and thank you for holding us together for the last 5 years. There are people who asked questions and they didn't get a chance to get responses, but we appreciate you so much. You are the people who made this forum what it is for the last 5 years. Special thank you to Omwanza Kemosi, Franklin Mukwanja, Edon Kibet, Pereso Cornelius, Crispin Bosire, and George Skem. Thank you all so much for taking time to engage with us today. We hope to see you again soon next week. We will circulate materials on our social media platforms, the Kabarak Law School pages. Be sure to follow us. Let me take this moment to give a special heartfelt gratitude to the people who have helped put this forum together. It has taken sweat, it has taken time, and we appreciate you. Thank you so much, Mr. Gekombe. Thank you so much, Sylvain Nyanchama. Thank you so much, Ruth Jabeth. Thank you so much, Cedric Kadima. Thank you so much, Mr. Ongoya, and the entire team at the Avid Readers Forum. Thank you so much once again, Honorable Gitobu Imanyara. We know that there are things you could be doing at this time. Thank you so much, Ms. Luciana Thuo. We know you've sneaked out of something that was already going on with your day to join us today. We do not take it for granted. We appreciate you for making us last this long. Thank you so much to our audience, our attendees. Thank you so much for always taking the time to join intellectual discourses. You are the rare type, and the world needs more people like you. If the future is in your hands, then the future is in safe hands. Till next time, which is quite literally next week. Goodbye. God bless you. Have a good evening.